Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my guest, John Constable. He's the director of the Renewable Energy Foundation. It is a public charity based in the UK. John, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's a great pleasure.
So now, I didn't warn you, John, but guests on this podcast introduce themselves. You have a long CV, you have a PhD, you have all kinds of credentials, but I put the onus on the guest to tell us who they are. So if you don't mind, imagine you've arrived somewhere and you have about 60 seconds, please.
I'm a lapsed academic, Robert. I read
a lapsed academic. Now I've had 90 some odd guests. I haven't heard that one yet. So good. Go by all means.
Go ahead. An academic in the humanities. I read English at Cambridge, and I moved off into the philosophy of aesthetics and general philosophy, language philosophy, actually, after a while. And then in 2005, to the great joy of my family, I bailed out and started to write about the energy industry. And I've been writing about energy matters ever since that time. I now direct the Renewable Energy Foundation, which is, as you said, a small UK charity, publishing data and analysis on the renewable sector. And I write generally about energy and particularly energy policy, of course, and such matters.
Good. If you could do me one favor, if you can get just a little closer to your receiver there, so you're a little louder, but it's okay where you are, but just a little more volume would be great. Yeah. Okay, so well then what? And I saw that you studied English and you got your PhD. So why? I want to talk about what's going on in Britain now, but first, why the switch? What led you to go from English and aesthetics to studying energy and power systems?
I've always had a very bad case of science envy. I like to study soluble problems rather than endlessly discussable mysteries. And the work that I was doing in the humanities was actually focused on soluble problems, which doesn't go down terribly well. And I didn't feel there was much room for that particular line of engagement in the future of English and its cultural studies more generally in the universities. And energy came up as an interesting subject. I've been working actually on the mathematics of verse forms with a physicist. And because of that, I'd had to learn quite a lot about order and randomness, because those are the features we were studying in languages. And so moving across into energy wasn't quite such a big leap as it might seem on paper. It all seemed to make complete sense to me, actually.
Well, I recall in your 2016 essay on, if I'm remembering it, energy, entropy, and the theory of wealth, you talk about working with a physicist. But let's come back to that. So, but the order of the day, the thing that I, in particular, is the news of the moment is the energy crisis in Europe. Tell me what's happening in Britain now, because from all appearances, you are approaching the cliff at very high speed, and you're looking at enormous increases in energy costs, et cetera. What's the latest?
Well, as you can see, the lights are on at present. The question is whether we will be able to afford to keep them on. Prices are due to go up very, very significantly quite shortly. We have a price cap applied by a previous government, very unwisely. But that is keeping the lid on prices at the moment. But energy suppliers are unable to contain the costs. So the prices will have to be passed on at some point to somebody. And the difficulty the government has is that they are intolerably high for consumers, and but suppliers somehow have to pay their costs.
And that's one of the reasons why we've seen these more than 24 bankruptcies of electricity
Right.
suppliers in the last 4 to 6 months. No.
Yes, these were quite small operations by and large, although there was one large one, in fact, did go bust. Now, the argument generally offered is that these were less well run than they perhaps should have been, and they were not hedging forward sufficiently correctly. But of course, when so many of them go bust, that does suggest perhaps the regulator hadn't been doing its work correctly and hadn't been checking up on these people to begin with. But in fact, the problem is much more general than this. We have a deeply distorted energy market, which is committed to high-cost energy and has made us critically dependent on one high-grade fuel, one reliable fuel, gas, to maintain security of supply, as have many other European states. Last year was a relatively low wind year, and that unfortunately correlated with international changes in demand for gas, which meant that gas prices have gone up to extremely high levels. The UK is very exposed on this particular point, partly because North Sea gas output has been declining ever since 2000. And we have, of course, suppressed the shale gas industry in the UK, as have most other European states. There's nothing going on here. In the US, of course, you have a very vibrant shale gas industry, which has increased production. We could have done quite a lot of that. We didn't. Consequently, we're importing a lot of gas, but are critically dependent on it. The expectation, false as it turned out from the government, was that the renewables, to which we are very heavily committed, would buffer us against these kinds of spikes in gas price. Of course, that hasn't been the case. In fact, the renewables industry is absorbing huge amounts of subsidy, about $13.5 billion per year at present in income support subsidy. That's taken from consumers. So the consumer headroom for fluctuations in energy costs has already been taken by subsidy to the renewables industry. And the renewables themselves are taking up a very large but fluctuating share of the market. Consequently, demand for gas for the electricity industry fluctuates from year to year. So this is an unstable market. We're not a very good customer for international suppliers of gas. We'd be much better off if we had a well-engineered and diverse fuel supply, a certain amount of gas, a certain amount of coals and nuclear, and maybe a bit of renewables at the edge. That's not what we have. What we actually have is a system which is dominated by renewables, but which is actually propped up and saved by gas.
You know, as you say that, John, what comes to mind as a guest, a lovely woman, Meredith Angwin, I've had on the podcast now 3 times, and she typifies what's the big danger. It's the fatal trifecta: over-reliance on renewables, over-reliance on gas, and over-reliance on imports. And it sounds to me like that's exactly what you have.
Yes, just you look at the UK fuel mix and you say, well, what this country has is a fuel diversity problem. Not enough diversity in supply. I mean, the assumption was the diversity of supplies of gas would be equivalent to a diversity of fuels. Well, that didn't seem very plausible when it was first offered in the early 2000s, and it hasn't proved to be the case. The real difficulty here is that the whole renewables agenda has proved to be so expensive, dramatically expensive, that the industry is distorted and chaotic. It's a mess. Nobody wants to build reliable generation in the UK. It's difficult to see any future for gas with current policies, and yet gas is absolutely essential to keep the lights on and indeed to heat homes in the UK.
You know, it's remarkable how you're repeating these things, John, because it sounds an awful lot like Texas, except with the difference that we're sitting on just staggering quantities of gas, and we produce more nat gas than, I think any other state. Pennsylvania has been vying with Texas for a while now, but we've made our grid here, ERCOT, too reliant on renewables, and there are no power stations are being built that are burning natural gas. We've closed a bunch of coal plants. And so the system has become over reliant on gas, and to fill the holes when renewables aren't doing anything, and that's exactly what we saw in February of last year. So, and the other part that I thought was interesting, and Mark Nelson pointed this out to me with the Radiant Energy Fund, that the UK deregulated its market under Thatcher, its electricity sector under Thatcher in the late 90s. Texas did it a few years later, but both the UK and Texas came into crisis at nearly the same time, or certainly the same year. But how much of this traces back to that deregulated market that took place back in the late 90s? How much of this is traceable to that?
The deregulation phase was absolutely beneficial, largely driven, in fact, by Lord Lawson, of course, and his reforms. It was beneficial for consumers. And at its apogee, in around about 2000, it was very promising. Things were looking really good. We were on track to build more nuclear power stations. We were moving towards further gas power stations, higher and higher efficiencies of gas. And the system was both cheap and indeed increasingly clean. So we were on track. We were decarbonizing without even trying. And at that point, when the liberalization move was at its peak, we started to introduce climate policies. And remember that the first COP was in 1995. And so the environmental movement started to really get its teeth into energy policy. And the first Blair government started to move us towards renewables in the early 2000s. So at the very moment when liberalization peaked, it was also over. because at that point, the Blair government started to introduce highly distorting mandates in favor of renewables, and those have been ramped up all the way through the 2000s. So it's not the liberalization that's the problem, it's the environmental policies that were introduced around about 2000, 2002 onwards that are the difficulty.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad you clarified that, because that, again, that rhymes with what we're seeing in Texas, in that under George W. Bush, there was the original target renewable energy. There was a renewable energy target that was quickly met, but it brought in a whole new big slug of wind, and then led to the construction of more power, high voltage transmission lines, the CREZ lines as they're known here in Texas. And that led to a surge in the build out of wind, but it was also fostered by these very lucrative federal subsidies, the production tax credit, which is still at over $20 a megawatt hour, and which is remarkable because that's roughly the price of wholesale power in Texas now. I think in 2020, the whole average price was $22. So we've just had a completely distorted market with distorted incentives. But I didn't have you on the show to talk about Texas necessarily, but it just is interesting to see the parallels in the degradation of the grid, of the respective grids, occurring at the same time of these big slugs of renewables are added.
Yes, and we introduced a subsidy system called the Renewables Obligation. It wasn't a tax credit system, it was a certificate system which applied increased costs directly to consumers. The Blair government had an enthusiasm for policies which redirected funds and resources but didn't put them onto the Treasury budget. So these were coming out of consumer bills to subsidy recipients without ever going through the Treasury, so kept off the books, if you like. And at the early stage, people weren't aware that these subsidies were happening at all. The industry, of course, was very aware, and there was an absolute stampede to build wind throughout Britain. And that ramped up very, very quickly. And as I say now, we have a legacy entitlement to those generators and many others, which is currently clocking at about $13.5 billion US dollars per year. Now, in the US terms, $13.5 billion is still quite a lot of money. In the UK terms, it's a lot. It's a very, very large additional cost for the consumer.
And those are paid for in a direct surcharge on customer bills.
Yes, all consumers, in fact. So domestic consumers would pay round about 1/3 of the total cost directly through their bills, but they will pay all the full cost, roughly $500 per household, something like that, because in addition to the direct bill impact, industrial and commercial customers pass on their share of the costs in the cost of goods and services. Inevitably, households meet all costs ultimately.
Sure. $500 per household per year is the average surcharge then, and for this.
That's the total cost. The electricity bit will be around about $170.
I see. So the 500 is the total, some of which is indirect, but the 170 is the direct.
Right. So you're paying quite a lot of extra for it. When you go to the store and buy a bottle of milk, it's refrigerated. The store has to pay for the electricity. They're not a charity. You're paying quite a lot. So there are a lot of hidden subsidy costs in the cost of living. And people, of course, have been grumbling about the cost of living for a long time in the UK.
Sure. I've talked with different people in the last few weeks about the UK relative to mainland Europe. Is Britain in a worse situation than France, Germany? It's the other cousins on the continent. How do you handicap this crisis in terms of who's being hit worst?
We have particular problems which are special to us. Being an island grid, in addition to the cost of actually subsidizing renewables as an investment, we also have increased grid management costs, and those have gone up very dramatically. So around about 2002-03, before renewables were introduced, our balancing costs were only about $400,000 per year. They're now around about $2.5 billion a year. Now, that sort of additional grid balancing cost doesn't apply so much on the continent because it's a very large interconnected system. So they can push their grid balancing problems around and obscure them to some degree. So we have a more acute balancing problem than the continent. We're also rather more exposed to gas than many of the European countries because we've converted so many of our domestic households to natural gas heating. So the gas crisis was really created in the electricity sector, but it affects the price of home heating for space and hot water. And so we're slightly more exposed, rather more exposed than many other European states on that measure.
And when you talk about grid balancing, explain what you mean there, please.
Well, supply and demand has to to meet, the grid has to be stable. And wind and solar are very unreliable, and the volatility of the system, the randomness in the system, it has increased over that time. So National Grid is intervening in the last hour of real time and buying on and buying off in order to ensure that supply and demand are met and that the grid remains stable and doesn't become unstable. We had a big blackout in 2019, of course, when in fact an accident occurred and they weren't able to contain the problem. Very expensive, very dangerous, naturally enough, and extremely controversial.
And so that balancing then, would that include capacity payments then to power plants to make sure that they're up and running hot ready, or I've forgotten the term of art for that, but it's payments to generators to be on standby or to be ready to go if the sun stops shining, the wind stops blowing, et cetera. Is that what part of those costs?
Yes, we do have a capacity mechanism, and that is part of the cost. But a lot of it's taking place in dynamic last-minute adjustments to supply and demand. And for example, a lot of our wind is in Scotland and north of a major bottleneck in the grid network. So that when it's windy and the Scottish wind is generating a great deal, they have to export, but there's congestion on the network. So what National Grid has to do is to pay the wind operators to stop in Scotland.
Oh, right,
but that leaves the market short south of the bottleneck, so they have to buy on at high cost south of the bottleneck. Now, these sort of balancing costs have gone through the roof since the introduction of renewables. So because of the subsidies overheated the market, renewables grew so fast, the grid network simply couldn't expand to keep up with it.
Right.
So we expanded our capacity vastly in excess of our ability to manage it at a reasonable cost for the consumer.
Well, let me follow up on that part of it, because that's the other dynamic that, and I just published a piece in Forbes yesterday about this, but that, the EU finally says, oh, natural gas and nuclear. Yeah, we probably need those. Yeah, those are a good idea. They were sustainable. Now they can be considered sustainable investments. But what we're seeing in the United States, and I've written about it a lot, and read about what's going on in Europe, and written some about it, is the break on the development of new renewables and high voltage transmission are land use conflicts in Ireland, in Scotland, in the UK. Is this still ongoing? The problem with siting more renewable capacity, is that how big of a problem is that, or challenge is that in the UK now?
Renewables are essentially a land play. These are very diffuse energy forms. They need extremely large areas of land to collect sufficient quantities to make them economically even barely viable. And of course, as we know, without subsidies, they're not viable. So yes, there is certainly a land use conflict problem. We had intense resistance to onshore wind when it was growing rapidly through the early 2000s. And David Cameron, to his credit, put a stop to that. At present, we're seeing an explosion in the growth of solar. So there are huge applications going in for solar, thousands of acres in a single application producing, and these are usually associated with batteries, as it happens. So, and these are becoming increasingly controversial. In addition to the mere in local environmental impact, people don't want to be surrounded by a solar farm of 1,000 acres. There's also the concern, of course, that we are losing farmland, and it's not necessarily a very clever idea to become overly dependent on imported food. Imports are fine, trading is good, but you want to be able to trade at an advantage. So you want to be able to say, well, we'll eat our own carrots this year rather than buying in from abroad. But
right.
We're losing farmland at an increasing rate, and the solar industry is a very large part of that now. We reckon that around about 1,000 acres a month is going into the planning system for solar, and this is becoming really quite controversial.
Same thing happening here. I just published in Forbes a letter from a woman who contacted me out of the blue. I vetted her, but Jessica Peterson in rural Iowa, and she and her family, she's a 6th generation Iowa farmer, and they're dead set against this expansion of this big solar project pushed by Invenergy, a big Chicago-based private company. But this backlash against wind has become now in the U.S. a backlash against solar. But talk about offshore wind, because you said this is now being a big push for solar in the UK, but there's also a big push for offshore. And as you know, I've had Gordon Hughes on the podcast, who's been studying offshore wind. I'll ask the question: is offshore wind a good deal for consumers?
It's a terrible deal for consumers. Gordon's work, and we work very closely together. Gordon's big papers on wind costs are published by Renewable Energy Foundation. It's one of the things we do. So when we receive a donation, that's how we actually spend our money. We put it into research and publication of this kind. Now, this kind of work, sort of thing, the industry will not do. Government doesn't wish to see it out there either, but it's very easy in a sense to find the data to actually do this work. We're still a relatively open market, relatively open society. We can find out the real costs of what's going on in the offshore and indeed the onshore wind sector. The industry says it's getting cheaper. Gordon and we looked at the audited accounts for wind companies. They don't seem to be getting cheaper. Actually, if anything, their costs are going up, certainly offshore. So
well, I found that on your website. I think the graph that I saw, and I think it was in one of Gordon's reports, was that since between 2002 and 2020, the cost per megawatt hour nearly tripled, as memory serves. Does that sound right to you?
They're certainly rising, and why is it then that government claims they're falling and the industry does, and they point to bids made for contracts for difference contracts. I'm sure that Gordon talked about this with you. Our view is that this is a market acquisition strategy, that they're bidding low in order to get the contracts, establish a market position, inhibit competition, create a lot of good PR for themselves, a lot of bad PR for nuclear, and then where they expect a bailout in due course when it turns out that these contracts are actually insufficient to cover the cost of capital and also critically operations and maintenance costs for wind. So we think this is the existing offshore wind is very expensive, 2 to 3 times the wholesale price before the current crisis. And the future costs, which are priced in at something like 50 to 60 pounds a megawatt hour, are only half what those sites really need to actually be economic. There hasn't been any dramatic cost reduction to justify these very low contract bids. So they'll need a bailout. So the existing wind is a bad deal. The wind that's projected is going to be a very bad deal. It'll be a bitter pill to have to bail these people out. Gordon and I were hoping that we would publicize this matter and that government would therefore be embarrassed and be unable to bail them out. Or indeed, these companies would begin to admit that they've made a mistake and they wouldn't actually activate these contracts before they become a liability in the future.
But you haven't been able to embarrass the government?
They're beyond embarrassment, I think.
Unembarrassable, I think, is the...
Yes, it would appear to be the case. It's over the political horizon. So many of these projects are unlikely to be built until the middle 20s. And by that time, the current politicians will be out of office and some are doing something else.
It's going to be someone else's problem to deal with.
Somebody else's problem altogether, yeah.
So one of the things that has been remarkable to me in watching this, obviously from the States, but I did testify before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee in November, and pointing to the number of industrial plants that are closing in Europe, and particularly the fertilizer plants, which bodes very ill for food prices and food productivity and so on. But is this, I'll ask the question directly, are these high gas and electricity prices, are we seeing the deindustrialization of the UK and Europe?
It's been going on for some time, actually. You will have heard over and over again, of course, boasts that we've reduced our emissions dramatically against 1990 levels. Well, all we've succeeded in doing, actually, is exporting those emissions to Asia. Carbon dioxide is one of the United Kingdom's most successful exports of recent years. Haven't we done well?
It's not Jaguars, then, is that what you're saying?
That is not, no. Carbon dioxide altogether. So we've actually deindustrialized to a degree, and we borrowed money to buy imports from Asia. So our production emissions may not be as high as they were, but our consumption emissions are, relatively speaking, unchanged. It's not quite the rosy story that is projected. Carbon leakage is a very big problem. But if you have a surcharge on total electricity consumption in the region of $13.5 billion per year, it's going to have an effect on your manufacturing. So we've been pushing such companies out of business and into other jurisdictions where energy is cheaper.
That idea of carbon leakage, I want to come back to that because I'm thinking more and more about the geopolitics of what's going on in Europe and the United States relative to Russia and China. But let me maybe come back to that. So I was also looking at your 2020 paper. You've written, you've been very prolific lately, and I want to talk about several of your essays. But you wrote in a 2020 paper called "Brink of Darkness: Britain's Fragile Power Grid." on the weakening of the grid. You said it's becoming weaker as progressively larger volumes of electricity from renewables such as wind and solar are forced into the system. This system enfeeblement, I like that word, is happening in spite of substantial increases in the cost of the system. So is there what must happen then to stop this enfeeblement? What is the next step? What must the UK do to pull itself out of this I don't know, disaster?
Well, we'll think of it physically. What we've done is we've increased the randomness in the UK electricity system. Well, that's why it's becoming fragile. We've introduced unreliable and high entropy sources such as wind and solar. They're barely energy at all. And we've made it impossible for high quality energy sources to actually exist in the UK markets. Well, what we have to do is reverse that. We have to accept that the physics of energy is important and to introduce and reintroduce and to make it possible to run a combined cycle gas turbine economically. And we may even have to build a coal plant. I mean, embarrassing though that may be, that is not completely off the table. We may have to build a coal plant in order to restore inertia to the UK system. Nuclear, of course, is a highly desirable generator, but it is a longer term option. It takes longer to build a nuclear power station. Both gas and coal could be done quite quickly.
Well, I'm interested that you said that about coal, because that was one of the headlines, I think just yesterday or the day before, that now France is saying that they may be burning more coal. I mean, it's just as, of all the remarkable headlines I've seen in this.
Yes, well, we still have some coal left, and it's pretty busy on low wind days. And it's not desirable to build an inefficient coal station, but a supercritical coal station might make sense. And I would prefer a gas to nuclear strategy myself. I think that would be much more sensible. We go for combined cycle gas turbines in the short term, stabilize the system, make it robust, get the renewables off the system, cancel the levies and subsidies, buy them back at a discount, reduce the system balancing costs, and start thinking about a longer term project for nuclear power, not just for electricity, of course. One of the points we've made repeatedly is that nuclear for heat is increasingly interesting. Now, there's more to the energy in an economy, of course, than electricity. And heat is a really crucial part of it. So low-cost heat enabling us to reindustrialize would be a very good idea indeed.
Well, God bless you for saying gas to nuclear, because this is we're singing from the same hymnal here. It's an issue I've been talking about now for more than a decade. End to end is what I call it, natural gas to nuclear. Your report, though, Brink of Darkness, I was intrigued by the painting on the cover of that report, and I looked for it. What was the source of that? Do you know who painted that image? It's quite striking.
I don't actually. The production team found those pretty pictures. The only things I'm responsible for are the text and the charts inside.
Well, I don't have it at hand, and I can't flash it on the screen here. But it looks like from in the Netherlands, maybe 300, 200 years old painting, but a young woman sitting next to a candle. Let me ask about. The two events that you wrote about in The Brink of Darkness. I think you've already mentioned one, is that there were two events that really catalyzed you, made you write that report, which now seems to be, you really did look at the future and see what was likely to happen. But one of the things that made you, as I recall, made you take that, write that report was the blackout in 2019. How extensive was that blackout?
Well, it affected a large part of the London area, but also certain parts as far as north of Newcastle Airport. Actually, it was widespread, but the London area is the crucial consideration. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that London, Britain is a city-state. It's London, and it has a rural hinterland around it, and that's unfair on some of the bigger cities. But electrically, it's not very far from the truth, actually. So the blackout in London, that's very high-profile news. And it affected a lot of people traveling, because trains tripped and then couldn't be restarted. So there were people stuck in carriages for long periods of time. And this was very embarrassing and indeed dangerous. It was a very close thing. The causes, well, very complicated, largely due to poor fault ride-through from renewables. There was a lightning strike and it took some people off the grid, and that caused a perturbation in the system. And then there was a cascade of tripping elsewhere. Some of them were fossil plants, in fact, but they weren't actually the core problem. The core problem was embedded renewables and a large offshore wind farm, and this is all covered in the official reports. Right?
Right.
It isn't a good example of just how the system had become really, fragile. It ought to have been able to take that kind of bump in its stride, and it couldn't. It fell over.
Well, you mentioned the word inertia before, and it's one that I've been intrigued by. And I was in Australia 5 years ago, and this was when they were having a lot of power problems. And the issue of grid inertia was one that they were talking about on the front pages of the papers there. And can you describe that? I mean, I could take my shot at it, but briefly, it's the grid inertia is the amount of momentum, I guess, in the electric grid itself. Is that? Can you explain that, please?
I think a helpful way to think about it is think the rotating mass of the turbine shafts is a way of storing energy. They're rotating at a tremendous rate, and they're very heavy. So the stored energy in there is considerable. They have gyroscopic stability, if you like, and that stored energy can absorb quite a lot of fluctuation in the grid. So fluctuation in demand can draw on, if necessary, the rotating energy in the shafts.
The kinetic energy there.
Kinetic energy, yeah, in the shafts. So it's like an energy storage system. There's a lot of fuss now about storing energy in batteries. Well, a well-run traditional system actually has quite a lot of energy stored in the rotating mass, kinetic energy of the rotating shafts. It makes the system very reliable in the sense that it can take a bump. A plant can fall off the system, but the rest of the system is so strong, it can hold it. Engineers sometimes refer to it as stiffness, which is quite a nice way of thinking about it. It doesn't just bend under impact. And renewables, of course, don't provide any of that. They don't have inertia. Consequently, they provide no stiffness to the system.
I think you said it well. I like that way of thinking about it, but it's that kinetic energy of the spinning shaft that provides the ride through that would allow it to overcome these interruptions, as you said. It's something that, in fact, I moderated a panel now 3 or 4 years ago, and Bill Magnus, who is now the former CEO of ERCOT, I asked him about these asynchronous generation issues in Texas because we were adding a lot of wind and solar, and he said, and I'm going to quote him almost exactly, he said at a certain point, he said, I just want a big spinning piece of steel. And so yes. to that point.
Yes, it's an energy storage device. I mean, a motor vehicle needs that too. I mean, a car has a flywheel for a reason. It needs something to store energy and smooth it out.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, that's interesting. So let me turn to some of the other work that you've done, John, because I'm fascinated by it, and some of your thinking on this I think is quite original. In 2016, and this is the lecture that my friend Mark Nelson pointed me to, and I think he attended the lecture that you gave in Northumberland on this. The lecture was Energy, Entropy, and the Theory of Wealth, and you neatly summarized this idea about energy. And you dismissed very clearly this idea that we can decouple the economy from the energy sector. You wrote, we never escape from the need for energy. Whatever the short-term variations might look like, the trend over time is for greater energy use to deliver and, crucially, to maintain and replace a human sphere that is progressively further away from thermodynamic equilibrium. There is no point at which you sit down and have a rest. Attempting to reverse the process observed in history by returning much or all of the energy system to low density, high entropy flows, which you've been talking about already, means handing over to those who control the renewable energy sector the majority of the potential for change available to our society. You're making some connections here that I think are really quite important and ones that I haven't seen anyone else making. But this idea, can you explain it? I've read, I think, one of the key points that you're making, but if I were to ask you to summarize your lecture on entropy and energy entropy and the theory of wealth, how would you do it?
Energy matters much, much more than economists realize.
Aha. And you quoted your friend, the physicist, who said, well, the problem with the economists is that they don't know what they're talking about. What was that?
He didn't mean it in a dismissive way. He meant very literally. They're not thinking about the ontology, the physics of the situation. And what is wealth? Well, it's an improbable state of matter in relation to a human requirement. How do you achieve improbability? Through energy. So everything, all wealth states are created by energy. And everything in the room behind you is a highly improbable object. Same in my room. So, and our economy is exactly the same. And much of that was created in the deep past. So we're still benefiting from energy conversions, creating improbable states of matter going back thousands of years. And you can give very strange and curious examples of this to show just how much it matters. Dutch cities are built on piles driven into the mud in the 15th and 16th centuries. There are roads in Britain running over very wetland areas, which are still held up and supported by bales of wool put down in the medieval period. Our whole economies rest on all the energy conversions that we've accumulated over our economic history. And of course, we replace and we renovate on the hoof all the time. So the instantaneous energy conversion in an economy, which is roughly about 5 to 10% of the cost in any one year, is only part of the story. The whole economy is energy over time. So you have to be very careful what you do with your energy supply. It's not something that it's trivial. Economists sometimes say it's only 5 or so percent of the economy. We can get away with an increase in cost. You can't, because what you're doing is storing up trouble for the future. So I wonder whether economies that have been heavily committed to renewables will have increased their costs and been creating capital with high cost energy will start to see signs of increasing costs that they can't completely understand or explain. Germany, for example. Has the German economy been poisoned by all these years of renewable energy? Well, we shall see. I want to see it stop as soon as we can in the UK and to get us back onto an economically sustainable path, because we're heading a situation right now where we may not be able to maintain our position. We're very far from thermodynamic equilibrium, and we don't want to slip back. The slipping back may be hard to arrest. Once you start moving back, it may be very hard to stop it slipping further and further back.
Well, you put it in some very, what I take from your that essay from 2016, as well as this one that you just have finished. I don't know if it's been published yet on the internet, but it's Misconceptions of the Industrial Revolution, Prospects for Individual Liberty in the Post-Pandemic Era. You make some similar points to your 2016 lecture, but at root, you're saying that the thought that comes to mind as you're saying that is something Art Berman, who's an oil analyst in Houston, and he's been on the podcast. He said, energy is the economy. Oil is the economy, and that you cannot separate them. And that I think what I hear you saying, or to paraphrase what you're saying, is you monkey around with this system and you introduce random energy sources into a system that is this complex, and you become more reliant on the randomness, then you imperil the whole system. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, if you start to degrade the order in your energy supply, you're going to be doing something very harmful to your overall system, and it may start to become unstable, which would be very undesirable. I think the problem here goes actually to something very fundamental in the philosophy of economics, which is that economists tend to think of energy as if it's a straightforward commodity for which there are substitutes. But you see, in a subtle sort of sense, and I'm a philosopher after all, energy doesn't exist at all. It's not actually a substance. It's a character state which all substances have. It's the ability to cause change. And this means that all inputs to the economy have an energy state which is relevant to their utility to human beings. And
so say that again, John, because I'm when you're saying that, I'm thinking you say energy is a character state. I'm thinking about energy flow. I'm thinking about energy versus power, right? We don't care. I've said it this way, that we don't care what energy is. We care what energy gives us, and energy matters when we can make it flow. And if we can't make it flow, it's useless to us.
Yes. So oil is a substance. It happens to have very high-grade energy properties. It can cause change. It's the ability to cause change, and there's great potential for change in oil and coal and in gas. There's much less potential in solar and wind. They're much closer to random heat. In fact, they're nearly useless. So you think of it like this. You think of the wind and the sun coming into the solar panel or the wind turbine, and then you think of the electricity being supplied to the consumer. You've got something very random on the one hand, the wind and the sun. You've got something highly ordered, very, very useful, as you say, coming out of a socket. Now, well, obviously something's happened in between to convert the high entropy to the low entropy of the service. What's actually happening is that a lot of correction is taking place. It's taking place through the wind turbines and the solar panels themselves. It's taking place through the system management of the electricity grid operator, and then it's given to the consumer to make use of. So there's a big flow of negative entropy going in there to rectify the defects of the solar and wind input. The question is, and I think the answer is no, can wind and solar correct itself Oil and coal and gas and nuclear are all such high-grade sources that they can provide and pay for their own channel to carry themselves to the consumer. Wind can't do this, and sun can't do this. The entropy is too high. They require correction from another source. At present, they're parasitic on the wealth created by high-grade fuels such as coal and gas and nuclear and oil, indeed.
So as you say that, I was thinking, well, my rejoinder would be something to the effect of, well, you don't make solar panels with solar panels.
You don't. And when we get to the stage where renewable energy inputs are the principal energy input for the manufacture of solar panels and wind turbines, then we'll see their costs go through the roof. They're only relatively cheap at the moment because they're made with fossil fuels.
Well, and to follow on that, one of the issues that I've written some about, and it's not gotten the kind of press here in the U.S. that I think it certainly deserves, but the U.S. government sanctioning imports of polysilicon makers in Xinjiang. So it's not just that the polysilicon in Xinjiang in China is being refined with coal-fired power plants. It's being made in many cases by slave labor from Uyghur Muslims, which it just is incredible to me. I mean, it brings to mind this question. It's not a rhetorical one, but how much slave labor is okay for you to consider this clean energy still? I mean, what is how much slave labor is okay with you, I guess, is another way of thinking.
I don't feel this question is on my conscience. I've been arguing against these things for a very long time. You should get the director of Greenpeace on and ask him about that. I think it's an important question, but what is actually creating the renewable industry? It's effectively created by cheap coal in Asia at present. And we know that the renewables industries that were created by subsidy in Europe have all failed. Vestas has not yet failed, but it's in trouble. It's an interesting company. It has periodic problems. The European solar industry collapsed, and it's all gone to China. We suspect the same will happen to the wind industry, what is left of it in Europe. The manufacturing costs are very high in Europe. They're obviously very much lower in China and in Asia generally. There are periodic attempts to reintroduce manufacturing, say to Scotland. They come to nothing. The industry is under a lot of pressure to reduce its costs. It cannot reduce its costs by making wind turbines here in Europe. If it did that, their costs would rise dramatically.
I don't know. I've studied this for a long time, and I still can't quite get my mind around how this blithe ignorance of these issues have been allowed to pervade the system in the way that they have. But let me go back to your essay for the Mont Pelerin Society. And you made this really remarkable point that you said that liberty doesn't create wealth. You kind of turned this idea about human liberty, and you wrote a lot about the Industrial Revolution. You said that liberty doesn't create wealth, it's the other way around, and that wealth in society was constricted for millennia because we were solely dependent on these random sources of energy. But it was the ability, you wrote, here it is, it is wealth, therefore, that is necessary to create freedom. Subsequently, the process is autocatalytic, which is a very good word. Greater freedom leading to still greater wealth. I shall suggest that there is consequently a realistic threat of deep and enduring reductions in aggregate national, regional, and indeed global wealth. Reductions that will lead, as implied by the axiom, to reductions in freedom. And that these reductions in freedom will be because we're constricting the society, restricting the economy to renewables. Have I stated this correctly?
That's correct. I was talking to a group of classical liberal economists, many of whom, of course, believe that wealth grew in Europe, particularly in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in the 19th centuries, because of liberal institutional and economic regulations. Now, there is some truth in that, but my argument is that actually those liberal societies emerged out of the wealth that had already been created by the increasing use of fossil fuels. First, peat in the Netherlands, then increasingly coal. And indeed, coal consumption predates what's classically referred to as the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1830. So coal consumption was 50% of British energy as early as 1700. And it was important as early as 1600. It's a very large part of British energy. So we're a divergent economy long before what people think of as the classic industrial revolution. And that tells you that something that was going on other than simple liberal societal reforms. It's the wealth which enables people to actually have liberal societies. And then, as I say, you have these strong autocatalytic effects. So some part of the classical liberal argument is definitely right, but you have to be rich in order to have a free society.
And to be rich, you have to have a lot of available energy.
And high quality energy, which the Europeans did. So that whole essay is trying to suggest to people that our conception of the English Industrial Revolution is obscuring the importance of energy in the growth of wealth within human societies. We tend to think that it's very instantaneous. So the term the English Industrial Revolution is deeply misleading. It wasn't solely English. It was actually Dutch, English, American phenomenon very, very early in the 17th century. You should think of this as it's Anglo-Dutch American, very early. And it's not solely industrial, it affects every aspect of society. And it's not a revolution in the usually accepted sense of the term. It's very slow. If it's a revolution, it's a planetary revolution taking a very long time indeed. It's certainly not a sudden turnover. And indeed, the British transition could be dated back to, 1400 onwards. That's when you see interesting changes, employment diversity increasing, and fuel diversity beginning to improve all the way through the 16th and 17th centuries, increasing amounts of coal coming in, economizing the use of wood for other purposes within the economy. And where does the term the English Industrial Revolution come from? Well, very interesting. Wasn't used until the 1880s in the English language. In fact, it's derived from French revolutionaries in the 1790s who were talking about their own political revolution and then saying, well, it's time we had an industrial revolution to match the political one that we've had. In the 1830s, French political economists started to notice that they hadn't had the industrial revolution, but something very dramatic appeared to be in process in Britain, monarchical backwards Britain. And this was put down in writing by a well-known political economist of that time, Blanqui, and was read by Engels, who used the term industrial revolution in his book in German on the condition of the English working classes. Marx used it in Capital, and it has no life in English until those works started to become better known to English writers in the late 1870s and early 1880s.
Via Arnold Toynbee.
Via Arnold Toynbee, the uncle of the famous Cycles of History, Toynbee. Yes, exactly. And it's an imposition on history. If you'd asked people in the 1790s in Britain, what do you think of the Industrial Revolution? They would have said, never heard of it. What on earth are you talking about? There's no such thing. And they wouldn't have described it because they didn't see any dramatic discontinuity in their economic development. And indeed, most economic historians writing in the latter half of the 19th century, Alfred Marshall, the founder of modern economics in many respects, explicitly rejected the term Industrial Revolution when Toynbee introduced it because he thought it was inaccurate and misleading, which indeed it is. So I think that it's important that we get it right because the key difference between the earlier stages of the British economy and the later ones is an energy difference. It's not industry exactly, it's energy. And this has been argued at length by Anthony Wrigley, the economic historian at Cambridge. And you very kindly said that some of the things I say in these papers are original. I hope some of it is, but much of it's derived by extensive work done by diligent economic historians such as Tony Wrigley at Cambridge.
But so then the progression, then to really drive this point home, because I think it's absolutely critical, is that the progression is energy, wealth, freedom.
Yes.
In that order, always, everywhere.
And then freedom creating more wealth.
And more energy.
So you get so you can actually absorb more energy and use it productively within your system. So you get autocatalytic growth.
So I want to bring up William Stanley Jevons because, of course, he's considered, in my mind, as far as I know, the first energy economist. And his book, The Coal Question, published 1865, right, which was this idea still being debated by economists and energy geeks today, is this idea of the rebound effect or the Jevons Paradox. I could take a whack at explaining it, but tell me what was the gist? What is the Jevons Paradox?
Jefferson's argument is, I think, underappreciated. It's, I think, misrepresented it by calling it a paradox. What Jevons did was to take an observation made by Justus von Liebig, the German chemist, who said that civilization was the economy of power.
The economy of power?
Economy of power was the economic use of power. In other words, force or the ability to cause change. And Jevons simply observed that when you improve the efficiency of a process, you save some energy. But do you actually conserve it, or do you turn it to another purpose? Well, of course, you turn it to another purpose. Now, that other purpose may be more of the same. You may use more of the same function, or you may do something else with it. But you will never actually pass up the opportunity to improve your life and those of others around you. You won't
so another way, if I could, so efficiency doesn't reduce energy use, it increases it.
Must increase it. It must increase it, and that is economic growth. So what Jevons was pointing to, it's not a theory. Some people talk about it as a theory. In fact, both Jevons and Liebig were pointing to a history and saying the evidence is there. You can see it. The growth of civilization and economic growth is the economy of power. So if an efficiency measure works, it means that the total consumption of energy will increase, inevitably. So consequently, when we look at the energy consumption profiles of, say, modern economies in the UK, France, Germany, and indeed to a degree the United States, what you see is not rising energy consumption. You see stagnant or even falling energy consumption. Stagnant in the US, definitely falling in some of the European states. That is not a good sign. That is not the direction in which it should be working. Somebody looks at that and says, well, that's energy efficiency. What that's doing is it's improving the efficiency. Well, can't be right. Jevons's logic is impeccable. If the efficiency measures were working, the total consumption would still be increasing. Something else must be happening. And in fact, the obvious interpretation is to look at the falling consumption, and then you look at the costs that are being imposed by policies over the last few years, and you say, actually, this is price rationing. People simply can't afford to consume the energy they would like to use.
Well, I like this idea, though, of energy being the fundamental basis of freedom, because I see this, and you point out to in some of this in the Mount Pelerin Society essay, but I've often thought in looking at what is happening here in the U.S., there's some of these moves in terms of banning the use of natural gas, prohibiting the sale of internal combustion engines. Some of this smacks of some totalitarian kind of, and I don't use this with any joy, but the state imposition of what individual consumers will be allowed to do, the amount of energy that they will be allowed to consume, the rationing of energy, the rationing of the types of energy. I think it's a slippery slope. I just really see this as there's a
politically dangerous. I agree. I don't think it's politically stable. One of the points I make in the Mont Pelerin Society paper is that these policies will concentrate the available capital in the energy sector. So what's the big change in the British industrial history from 1500 to 1900? The energy sector changed. It changed from being land to being coal. In the middle of the 18th century, the energy sector, land, dominated the economy. Landowners employed 3/4 of the working people of Britain in 1750.
Because that was the only way to get energy, for whether it was by feeding draft horses or whatever.
A very low productivity energy sector. And most people worked in the energy sector on the land. Only a very few people worked outside the energy sector, creating other kinds of wealth. By 1900, that had changed dramatically. The energy sector was only a minority part of the total economy because the energy margin, the energy return on energy invested, was so large that people could do lots of other things apart from working in the energy sector and working for landowners. So it was liberating. What broke the power of land wasn't politics, it was coal, actually. It was because the rest of the economy became so rich that the importance of land declined. Now, what we're doing is reversing that trend. We're saying we're trying to force people back into a low productivity energy sector. The energy sector will become a larger part of the total economy. Wages will fall, naturally. The non-energy sector will contract. It's quite possible that the overall economy will contract. But the power of people who own renewable energy generating technologies and the systems will increase. They'll be like the aristocrats of the 18th century. That's not politically sustainable. People have got used to these very free, open societies where the owners of the energy sector do not have dominant power, and it will not be politically tolerable. I can see intense pressure for the sequestration of renewable energy assets and taking them into public ownership so that they don't become dominantly politically influential. And ultimately, I fully expect the renewables venture to fail. In 30 years' time, I don't expect there to be any renewables in our systems at all. We will have seen the light about this, and we will have taken the gas to nuclear path. Now, it's conceivable we get it wrong, in which case we'll have other problems to worry about.
Well, to quote a friend of mine, from your lips to God's ears, was that the line that comes to mind. But this idea of energy rationing, I think, is quite dangerous. And this idea of limiting choice is quite dangerous. And you mentioned Engels and Marx, so I wanted to bring up another guest who's been on the podcast, Emmett Penny. He's read Marx. I haven't read Marx. I haven't read Engels. I haven't read a lot of stuff. I write a lot, read some. He said that if Marx were alive, Marx would be an energy maximalist, which I thought was an interesting idea, right? But it goes to your point about the liberating force of energy for the poor and the middle class is key to all of this. And yet what we see in the United States and now in the UK is the increased price of energy is going to force a rationing of energy use in the poor and the middle class. So I'll ask the question, if Marx were alive, would he be an energy maximalist?
I think Marx wanted to see the lives of human beings improved. I mean, so he went about it in a rather strange way, but his intentions were good. Yes, I think he probably would. I mean, energy is simply a way of changing the world. The point is to change the world, said Marx. Energy is a way of changing the world to human advantage. And if you start restricting the use of energy, inevitably you will harm human welfare. It's as simple as that. And if you start forcing people to use energy in particular ways, you will do the same.
And I think it's a really important point, John, and it's one that I'm glad you're making. By the way, I should interrupt. I haven't done my station identification. My guest today is John Constable. He's the director of the Renewable Energy Foundation, which is a public charity in the UK. You can contribute. It is a small foundation, and they could use a donation. You can find them at ref.org.uk. Let me read this the summary paragraph here in your piece for the Mount Pelerin Society, which I guess you delivered this last year, I guess in 2021. Is that right?
Yes, in November in Guatemala City.
You talked about this. We talked about the autocatalytic effect of human liberty on wealth. But this, you say that this self-poisoning, which I think is a really powerful word, that this self-poisoning that will occur as wealth is destroyed and human liberty eroded could have consequences that are rapidly manifested. I've spent much of this paper arguing that in general, we overdiagnose the existence of revolutionary transitions and discontinuities in societal affairs, but I did not and do not deny their possibility of their factual existence. And here's the money lines here. In coercing a change of fuels against the thermodynamic gradient, in other words, going toward renewables, forcing the use of higher entropy sources that would be and indeed have hitherto been spontaneously rejected in a liberal market because harmful to human welfare, it is possible that the state apparatus may trigger a discontinuity. Humanity has slowly climbed, and arduously, yet almost unwittingly up Mount Improbable, and now enjoys remarkable prospects. But should we lose our hand and footholds, we are all but certain to slide rapidly and with much injury down its steep and unforgiving slopes. I mean, you're forecasting some could be some very ruinous economic and political outcomes unless we come to our senses. Is that a good summary?
I'm saying it could be very dangerous indeed, and we shouldn't expect the down path from high energy societies to be gentle as it was on the upgrade. So it took a very long time to get where we are today. Growth has been very slow. I mean, societies have always been going into exponential growth, but they weren't able to sustain it. With the introduction of coal and then oil and gas and nuclear, we've been able to sustain growth and exponential growth for quite a few years now. But up until the last century or two, growth curve was very slow and arduous. What I'm suggesting in that paper is that There's no discontinuity in the English Industrial Revolution, so-called. It was a very long process. Yeah. But if we get our energy supply wrong, we shouldn't console ourselves with the idea that there won't be a discontinuity in the future. The decline could exhibit what will actually be quite salient to people over short periods of time. It will feel like a discontinuity. We will suddenly be much poorer. There's a risk that this is true. As I say, you climb slowly, but you fall very fast.
So what is this attraction around renewable energy? I've thought about it. I've written about it. I've, lectured about why,
Yes.
and I get this question about why this attraction. And I think it smacks of some, there's a religious aspect to this. There's ideas about the Garden of Eden and returning. And in fact, a friend of mine suggested, remember Joni Mitchell's song Woodstock, we have to get back to the garden. Where's this attraction from renewables? Why is this idea of wind and solar so attractive to so many people?
It's goop energy, I fear. It's natural. It's the idea that it's
goop energy.
Yes. It's Gwyneth Paltrow's goop. It's,
oh, okay, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. It seems that it's a gift, so it's approved by nature. It's provided. It's not unnatural and produced by human beings. Therefore, it's a gift from the natural world. Perhaps it's the free lunch. It's believed that ultimately we have at last found the free lunch, and the free lunch is wind and solar. But
it's a mirage.
Yes, it is in fact a mirage. If we wish to have a clean society, and indeed if we wish to preserve the natural world, we're going to need much more energy rather than less. So conservation of the natural world will become one more human requirement for which we will need very considerable energy consumption. And it has to be from small footprints. That's the part that to me is so obvious. Right. That the denser, the better. Denser, the better. So there is an intense conflict, in fact, between environmentalism and land-hungry renewables, and that's beginning to manifest itself. I mean, the environmentalists have a long track record of regretting their purchases. They have buyer's remorse over and over again about this. They're keen about diesel engines, and then they find that actually diesel is very wicked and they mustn't have it. They're keen on biomass, and then they suddenly find that burning 25 million US trees a year in a British power station is not such a good idea after all. That's right. Well, we could have told them that to begin with, but they weren't listening, unfortunately. That's it. The Drax plant, is that not right? Yes, yeah. That's right, which is an enabling technology for wind and solar. It's a way of actually getting away with all that wind and solar. So the attractions of wind and solar, yes, I think it's a natural energy source. It appears to people to be free, which of course it isn't, because the conversion and delivery costs are so high. And also the iconography of wind particularly is very powerful. The wind turbine is a ubiquitous modern image. It's a crucifix and a flower. It symbolizes sacrifice and rebirth all in one somewhat questionable image. It's a gift to a PR agent, in fact. And I do see those. I spoke in front of her. It was a large audience and a large company, and they were in the oil and gas business. And one of the slides they had behind the stage when I took the stage was a wind turbine. And the first thing I said when I got up there, I said, "You're an oil and gas company. What are you doing here? What is this about?" I mean, it was even in their own presentation. I thought, do you not understand what you're doing here? But these images that you're using? Well, at some point, that image will become a disgrace. When it's better understood that this is a way of exploiting the consumer, seeing those things will become nauseating. And one will simply realize that they're a symbol of all the mistakes we've made about the energy sector. Going back to your question about what is it about renewables that seems so attractive, I think it is the key thing here is that we're all so rich that we've forgotten a lot about physics. We've forgotten about the difficulty of actually doing work. And we want to sit down, have a rest. Like I say in my paper, you can't do that. You've really got to, if you don't work, you die. And we need to have the energy to keep on doing the work for us. But the wind turbines and the solar panels suggest that actually, yes, we can take a rest. We can take a holiday. And it isn't true. And it's very dangerous to do that. We're going to learn the hard way, I fear. Both our countries have done so much renewables now that a lot of damage is done. Even if we were to change policy today, I wish we could, there would still be a lot of damage which we'll have to live with for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years or more. A lot of wealth forgone. So what motivates you on this, John? I mean, you speak passionately about it. You write passionately about it. You've got
As my father would say, you have the bit in your teeth. Why?
I do think civilization is worth preserving. And without a healthy energy supply, we may not be able to preserve it. And I'm more of an historian and a philosopher than most people in the energy sector. I have perhaps a stronger sense that there's a lot at stake here, actually. As you've said, we've been talking about human freedom, but there's a great deal else at stake involved in that. It's just the well-being of our families into the future, our children, and also the sophistication of our thought. Also the tolerances which we value in society, liberal societies, are actually at risk if we get energy wrong. I want a free and open society, and I'm sure you do as well. That is at hazard. If we don't get our energy supply right, we may slip back into periods which are much more repressive and less tolerant. I simply don't want to see that. And so, yes, I am very motivated about this. It's not simply for me a matter of cost, because the costs actually have very important dimensions and depths to them, which go well beyond not being able to afford another car next year or have a second holiday this year, but really to do with deep qualities in our life and the values of which we actually hold dear in contemporary America and Britain.
The costs aren't just at the fuel pump or in the electric bill.
No, they're in your mind. They're in the prospects for our children and the sort of lives they will be able to lead, sort of things that they will be able to do, which may be much more constricted and less pleasant than the lives we've led. And I think that's very worrying indeed.
Well, and as to your point, I think the costs are also on destroyed landscapes. And this is the part that I cannot get around it. And I'm an avid bird watcher, and so is Matt Ridley, and we talked about birds, and I regularly do it. And this idea of these environmental groups, I quit calling, actually, they're activist groups. I mean, they're not environment. They don't, in my opinion, in many cases, they just don't care about environment at all because they're campaigners. But this is just destruction of the landscape. Oh, well, you just put it out there in flyover country. Screw those, those poor bumpkins out there. We don't give a darn about them. We'll just put it on their backyard, but we're not going to have it here in Montauk or in Malibu. No, can't have that. But it turns the whole system of nature and valuing nature on its head to me. And that's the part that I just cannot get past, and I cannot forgive. But anyway, that's my. So whose work on this do you admire, John? My guest again is John Constable from the Renewable Energy Foundation. Whose work are you reading? Whose work on these issues do you admire?
On the history of energy use,
or just the broad field of energetics and power and so on.
I find a great deal of economic history interesting. So Anthony Wrigley at Cambridge is a particular favorite of mine. Very detailed work on energy use in English history, which I think is so deeply suggestive. It's the one I'd recommend to everybody.
Any particular books by Wrigley?
Yes, Energy and the English Industrial Revolution, Cambridge University Press, 2010, 11.
Okay.
That's the one. Yes, and any good basic primer on the physics of energy. Hard work for somebody educated in the humanities like me, but very, very rewarding. If I could go back, I'd take an intensive physics course as an undergraduate and make sure that I didn't lose sight of that.
Right. Jesse Ausubel's work was a great influence on me. So Václav Smil as well. But so what about now? You're sitting in front of shelves full of books. What are you reading now? What's on your bookshelf or on your nightstand or your desk at the moment?
Well, like many people surrounded by books, I read in books. So I hop around reading a chapter here, a chapter there.
I skim a lot of books. I buy books and I skim a lot of books.
Well, no, there are very few books that are true books. Most of them have an academic article or two somewhere buried in there. The first thing you should do is check the acknowledgement at the front.
What's the idea of the novel as a short story padded? Was that the...
Yeah, something like that. Well, look at the acknowledgements at the front of most academic books, particularly. You'll see it says, "I'd like to thank the editor of the Journal of this and that for allowing me to reprint chapter 16. And you say, it's chapter 16 is the one I have to read then. And then probably the rest of it is not so important. I'm reading a great deal. I have Marx here too, as you probably see behind me. At the moment, I'm thinking intensively about the history of the English Industrial Revolution, partly because of that paper which you referred to, the Montpellier paper, which I do hope to publish in full reasonably soon. So I've been studying the history of the term English Industrial Revolution. That's what I've actually been working on in much of the last few months.
And so how much? Well, this is a side question, but so how much do Bolton and Watt and their work does that figure into your research?
Well, they're technologists, a point I wish to develop in future work is to remind people that technology is not a spirit. It's actually a very expensive achievement. And so we're told frequently that technology will certainly address the deficiencies of renewables, but that's a very high cost solution. Technology is not a spirit. It's a very expensive thing to do. It's a very sophisticated and improbable state of affairs.
It's interesting. I'll just add one idea to that. This idea, we'll innovate and we'll find something new. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, like no one has thought about replacing gasoline in the last 100 years. I mean, these are not new problems.
No, and there's been continuous innovation and improvement in the fossil fuel sector. And we say over and over here that we'd probably be in a much better state with regard to decarbonisation if we hadn't introduced renewables into our system. We'd have low cost and progressively cleaner electricity. Our cars would be lower cost and lower consuming. And we'd actually be on the track to net zero. It might not be in 2050, it might be much further off, but we'd be on a sustainable track because you wouldn't be confronting the population with poverty and unacceptable reductions in standard of living, which will turn them against the whole idea of reducing emissions in any case. Now, there are many opinions about the strength of the need to reduce emissions, but it's quite perfectly rational to have a climate policy. It's just that your climate policy has to be rational, and ours simply isn't rational at present. It doesn't pass the three basic tests. I mean, this is an insurance policy, isn't it? So it should pass the basic tests of an insurance policy. It should provide real cover. It should provide that cover at a premium, which is proportional to the risk, hazard times probability, insofar as we understand it. A lot of big questions there. And of course, the premium should be affordable in itself. Our climate policies don't pass any of these tests. There's no real cover, and the premium is exorbitant in relation to the risk, and the absolute cost is absolutely astronomical. So the public is going to be disenchanted with all this. And you can latch onto this very simply, by looking at a thing called the social cost of carbon, which is a measure that economists use to say, well, what's the harm that's going to be done by emitting a ton of carbon dioxide today?
Right.
Well, there are a lot of estimates, but the middle range of this and the density of estimates is round about $50 per ton of carbon dioxide. That's the harm done. How much does the abatement cost of renewable energy cost? Well, in the UK, rooftop solar is round about $1,000 per ton.
Right.
It's many, many times worse than the harm it's trying to prevent. Offshore wind, $200, $300, $400 a ton. Onshore wind, $100, $200 a ton, something like this. So the cure is worse than the disease. Now, the long-term prediction for that is that the public will reject this. They're going to say, you've been offering us a cure which is vastly worse than the disease. You've been telling us to take chemotherapy for a cold, and we're just not going to do that. So I think the environmentalists should wake up to this problem and say that renewable energy is actually a threat to long-term, stable, and perfectly reasonable environmental policy, which could command public acceptance and tolerance for the foreseeable future. Renewables are actually going to damage this agenda. They need to stop it quite soon.
Well, last question then, John. We've talked more than an hour, and I like to keep my podcasts at about an hour, and it's been quite enjoyable. And I'm sure I could, keep peppering you with questions. This is a remarkable conversation, and really quite enlightening. These ideas around entropy and wealth and energy are fascinating. What gives you hope?
Human beings are remarkably resilient, and they tend to do the right thing eventually. We're very good at learning. We put up with misinstruction from government for just so long, and then we push back. So I have some hope about it. I think the younger generation, reasonably good. I have 3 boys. My eldest boy now left university, but I can remember him coming back from school with an answer sheet about renewable energy and showing it to me, and it had been marked by his teacher, and there were some ticks along the side. And I said to him, John, a lot of these answers you've given here are not, strictly speaking, true, actually. And he said, Yeah, Dad, we all know that, but those are the right answers.
According to the university, they're the right answers.
Yeah, right. And I think that's how it is with people. I mean, people will pay lip service to the orthodoxy, but they actually know perfectly well that a lot of what's going on in the energy sector is not a good idea, and that they will push back against it. But there's a lot of work for us to do. I mean, unless we generate good information and keep the public debate going, there will be problems. The sooner we fix this, the better. But my hope is that basically people are very sensible, and they will eventually respond to the information and to the debate. We needn't give up yet.
Agreed fully on that part. Absolutely. Do not give up. Well, my guest has been John Constable. He is the director of the Renewable Energy Foundation. It is a public charity in the UK. They are accepting donations. You can find John and all of his work at ref.org.uk. John, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast. It's been great fun.
Thank you very much, Robert. Great pleasure.
And to all of you in podcast land, thanks for tuning in. Tune in to the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.